We know that psychedelics have a particular neurological effect on us, right? They shift the brain to a more primitive, animalistic form of consciousness. It's a form of consciousness we share with other animals, and it takes us away from the distinctly human form of consciousness that you and I are operating in right now. So that's one way to define it, as a sort of a neurological shift in how our cognition works. I think it's useful for different populations in different ways. So my focus is on people who are looking to treat their mental health concerns, meaning that these are people that are suffering from anxiety, depression, panic, dissociation, relationship problems that could be caused by all of these. They're suffering from childhood trauma and neglect and abandonment. From what I've seen anecdotally, I think most people that are very excited and going for psychedelic work, whether it's psychedelic therapy or these sort of intensive retreats, are going for their mental health concerns.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Psychedelic Conversations podcast. I have with me a very special guest in the realm of psychedelic psychotherapy, and his name is Saj Razvi, and he's from the PSI, Psychedelic Somatic Institute. And I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of context of his background and what he does. So Razvi is the Director of Education at PSI. He is a psychotherapist and former clinical researcher in the MAPS Phase 2 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. He is faculty at Mind Medicine Australia and taught PTSD studies at the University of Denver. He is one of the primary developers of the Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy, PSIP modality, which is a next-generation primary consciousness-oriented psychotherapy. And I cannot wait to dive in. So welcome, Saj. Such a pleasure to have you.
Hi, Susan. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. As usual, we love to find out about our guests, and our listeners really appreciate your background. So if you could maybe just give us a little glimpse of what brought you to this work? How did you come into it?
Yeah, happy to. Back in the late 90s, I was working at IBM, and I decided, I was working with computers and I was not terribly satisfied. And so I decided to do a graduate school program in psychology for the fun of it, for the learning experience of it. When I interviewed for the program, I actually told my interviewers that I have no interest in doing this as a job because it seemed to me the most miserable job on the planet to sit there and really take in people's awful experiences for, hours a day. And somehow they let me into the program still. Probably a semester or so into it, I realized that I was insane, right? I realized that the programming that I had, the water that I swam in from sort of my childhood programming was kind of nuts. And I just didn't realize it up until that point, right? Because it was all non-conscious programming that I just operated by. And if you want, I can give you a quick example of what I mean by this.
Please do. Please do.
So I was in a weekend workshop for the modality that I teach at this point, and there was one of the ideas in that model is that trauma is always a violation of a boundary, and so usually that people who have trauma or even especially developmental trauma from childhood have a really disturbed ability to say no in the world. And they also typically have a disturbed ability around saying yes in the world. And so we did this exercise of, imagining some people in our lives and seeing, can we say no to that person imaginally, and then tracking our body response, tracking our nervous system response. And I found myself very able to say no to anybody. I thought I was doing great, and I was. And I could. The idea with this model is that the hardest people for us to say no to are the people that are closest to us. So in terms of our psyche, that would be mom. And so I found myself. It was pretty easy for me to do that. So the instructor came over to me and said, when somebody's that good at one side of this spectrum, we want to see what the other side looks like. So he asked me, is there somebody, can you imagine, somebody in your life that you can say yes to? And I sat there and I thought about it, and I looked at him and I said, why would I say yes to anybody in my life? And mind you, I had a girlfriend at the time, like I was in a relationship, and I was still saying the statement, why would I say yes to anybody? And let me, again, the context of this was, at this point, I was probably a third year graduate student in the field of psychology, and it did not occur to me that that was a strange thing to say. Right. So that's kind of what I mean by, we acclimate to whatever our developmental water is, and we go with it typically.
Yeah. Wow. It's really powerful. And without the self-awareness, how does one know about their own programming? Right. And that's why I find your program or the modality to be so valuable right now, especially in this psychedelic renaissance that is happening. That's one of the reasons that I really would like to dive into, what does psychedelic psychotherapy, and, how would you describe it? Who needs it? Why do we need it? Especially, working in the medicines, because from my understanding, Saj, right now, there is a division, maybe more than two movements are happening. One would be the spiritual aspect. When I first were introduced to the psychedelic medicines, it was almost always about the mystical and the spiritual experiences that wrapped around the whole process. And similar to you, coming from a background of swimming in that family trauma and all of these deeply wired programming, there was a massive part of me that was so dissociated, and I couldn't connect to that spirituality element. And that's when I started questioning. It's almost like if you're in those kind of circles and everybody is talking and practicing, and it's very visible that very much into their, the spiritual practices and all of that. And suddenly you're just the odd one out. Somehow you start to think, okay, I'm not feeling what they're feeling. I cannot connect to what they are talking about. I feel like my reality is very mundane, and I'm here and I haven't gone anywhere, because there are a lot of people that, talk about speaking to angels and, godlike creatures and transcendence. And as you know, unity consciousness. And there's me sitting in anxiety, overwhelm, and actually a lot of pain. I thought, this is not what I expected, and I felt really the odd one out. And after a while, obviously now further down the line, I realized I have a feeling a lot of people feel this way, but they don't speak it out so much. That's why I find so much value in your programs. Please speak to us. What does that mean? The psychedelic psychotherapy, and how does it help? Who needs it, and why do we need it in that psychedelic space, especially?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a number of different ways to define it, but certainly, we know that psychedelics have a particular neurological effect on us, right? They disrupt the default mode network, which is been very well demonstrated by Robin Carhart Harris in his work. And they shift the brain to a more primitive, animalistic form of consciousness. It's a form of consciousness we share with, other animals, and it takes us away from the distinctly human form of consciousness that you and I are operating in right now. So that's one way to define it, as a sort of a neurological shift in how our cognition works. I think it's useful for different populations in different ways. So my focus is on people who are looking to treat their mental health concerns, meaning that these are people that are suffering from anxiety, depression, panic, dissociation, relationship problems that could be caused by all of these. They're suffering from childhood trauma and neglect and abandonment. And I think from what I've seen anecdotally, I think most people that are very excited and going for psychedelic work, whether it's psychedelic therapy or, these sort of intensive retreats, are going for their mental health concerns. And I think then the question comes up around what you were describing, whether this is let me back up one second and just say, that psychedelics also, so as we're shifting more to this more animalistic form of cognition, I think the research backs this up, that the modalities that we use for working with people sort of ought to be more consistent, congruent with those more. We're entering a much more experiential mindset rather than a insight-based mindset. So think about a dream, because when we enter a dream, we're entering our primary conscious way of operating. And a dream doesn't make logical sense. It doesn't make rational sense. It's not even linear. And sometimes it's not even verbal. You're just walking in a dream. Things about what's happening. The whole world of your dream has a mood or a tone to it that would be hard to put into words. I think that's the realm that psychedelics take us. So I think of it like a waking dream, right? And oftentimes it can be, we enter into our waking nightmare. But the whole benefit of this is that we're taking a whole lot of resources with us into that nightmare, resources that perhaps we didn't have when these events originally happened to us, right? So, and certainly spiritual resources, but also, relational resources. So this gets back to the point that you were raising, which was, there are different directions that I think we can go with psychedelic therapy. And the direction that most of what we've been seeing is definitely towards the transpersonal, transegoic, spiritual, unity consciousness world, right? So, however, I think that we often see with that is that, it's an amazing experience, but if the reasons why we're going into psychedelic work in the first place is because of our own biographical suffering that we're experiencing, meaning suffering that's really based in your history, your conditioning, then we find that it can be much more useful for people if they're using the psychedelic experience to focus on their humanness as opposed to their godness, as it were, right? I think, the way that I think about it is that, there are plenty of people that have done extraordinary transpersonal work. They know the face of God, they know the beauty of the universe, and they can't be in a relationship, right?
Wow, that's very powerful to say, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because these are very different areas of our being that we're working on. I think it can be very valuable to touch into that transpersonal world and sort of bring it back with you to sort of, stir up the version of reality that you're holding inside of you. That can be wonderful. But the core belief at PSI is that human relational wounding requires human relational healing. Right? We cannot bypass that level. So, the transpersonal does not making contact with the transpersonal will not redo a person's attachment style, which is a very clinically well-known phenomenon that happens between the ages of 0 and 2. It could change our sense of the goodness of the world, but that doesn't necessarily change our core experience of other human beings.
Yeah, that's very powerful to learn right now, especially as you said, from my observations, a lot of people coming into the healing space of psychedelic medicines through the spiritual, through the divine, through the unity consciousness. And I heard you say in one of your videos, before unity consciousness, we have work to do. And you talked about the 3 levels of consciousness that really stayed with me. And I've been also applying that to my own work and myself and everything I touch and I do right now. And obviously coming from understanding the body's role in our humanness, it was easy for me to grasp that the levels of consciousness. Maybe if you could speak to that for us as well, for our listeners.
Yeah. So what you're referring to is a speculative model that we proposed of a recommended trajectory of a person's work through the psychedelic realms. If they're the mental health population, if they're approaching us with trauma and developmental wounding. And the idea with this, the first tier is what we would call, psychobiological compromise of the nervous system. And basically what that means is, when your nervous system is quite charged and reactive based on the threats that you've experienced in your life, right? And that goes all the way from sort of mild anxiety to panic to depression, hopelessness, collapse states, and all the way to much more dissociative states. Yeah, you get to something like dissociative identity disorders. And so here's the idea with this, Susan, that look, if you have a lot of trauma in your life and your system is managing that trauma through compartmentalization and dissociation, and this is a very physiological response, right? This is this is a nervous system response. So if you have trauma-based dissociation, what's happening there is that your mind, your nervous system are releasing endogenous opioids, meaning I don't mean opioids that you would go out and take, but just your internal pharmacy is creating these endogenous opioids to numb you out and sort of protect you from the pain of these childhood memories. And if your system is loaded up with that, imagine that person then going off and doing sort of high dose medicine experiences or medicine retreats that are not designed as a container for sort of that mental health phenomena of dissociation and trauma and things like that. Essentially, what we find is that either the transpersonal process doesn't have any effect at all, which we have seen. If you interview anybody working with psilocybin, they will tell you that there are a fair amount of complete non-responders to psilocybin. And what's happening there is that this person's taking a psychedelic medicine to deal with the stresses and traumas of their life. And at the same time, their mind is releasing these endogenous opioids. And typically the opioids will crush the psychedelic experience. So that's one thing that could happen. Like you take a psychedelic and you feel nothing. You feel like you could just go on through it with your day. And the other thing that happens is that, people will have transpersonal experiences, but the relationships, the wounding that's being held in dissociation does not get touched, right? It's not penetrable to the transpersonal experience. And I think we find this quite frequently, right? If people have dissociative protective mechanisms, the transpersonal processes typically don't go there. So anyway, back to your question. So the first tier really is, working with the compromise of your biology that happens with stress and trauma, right? So stress, anxiety, panic, anger issues, depression, depersonalization, numbness generally to life, right? That kind of thing. That's the first tier. Once we get that cleared up, then people sort of organically move to a second tier, which is sort of a deeper level of work. This is the work at which personality actually starts to get challenged, right? So in my experience of the MAPS trials, MDMA really seems to work well, very well, with the events that have taken place in a person's life that cause mental health repercussions. What MDMA does not do is challenge personality, right? And that meaning that, if you have narcissistic defenses, if you have, something going on at a very deep kernel of your personality that's due to your developmental programming very early on, MDMA doesn't take that apart versus something like the true tryptamines like psilocybin, sort of those medicines really do challenge that level of your being. And it's a really, you can imagine, it's a deconstruction and then reconstruction of personality. And so you can imagine that's very destabilizing, right? And I would say that, by the way, I would say that for all of psychedelic therapy, that it is inherently destabilizing. And there's things that we can do to hold that and support clients through that. But there's no way around to do the deconstruction work that needs to be done, and the client doesn't feel the destabilization of that. So anyway, that's tier 1, psychobiological. Tier 2 is personality. And again, what I would say about that is, in my experience of it, it's like the world comes apart at its seams in a way that, and you're recognizing that there's a great deal of your programming and who you are as a person that is conditioned, right? That was formed through your childhood, and so when that begins to come apart, people are typically amazed. They had a sense like, I thought this was truly the world. I think we can look at events that have happened to us and say like, oh, that was a horrible event, but that's not me. But when tier 2 happens and your whole personality begins to come apart, I think people are very surprised at that. And then there's tier 3, which we don't do a whole lot of work in or talk about, because again, I think that's really well addressed in the transpersonal space. And the idea with this trajectory is to say, as long as people are, coming to you and they have depression and anxiety and mental health concerns, it's useful for them to begin at the foundational level and work their way up to the transpersonal level. And I will say, if people don't have that, if they don't have a lot of attachment wounding or dissociation or trauma from childhood, by all means, go for tier 3, right? Have like that tier 3 experience. I don't want to take anything away from it. It's wonderful. It's extraordinary. It really does shift things at a cosmological level. Your entire relationship with the universe can be shifted with that kind of work. So I'm not taking away from it. I want to put it into context and say there's other things to be done before people get there.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and it's very clear. And as a human being, I haven't seen anybody who hasn't been touched by trauma.
Yeah.
As human beings growing up in all kinds of environments and dynamics within family, dynamics, it's very rare. Anyway, in my work, I haven't seen anybody. So I think it really helps for us to understand and also, have that awareness where we are on our work. So let's not jump ahead before we haven't. So I have this concept that I talk a lot about. Let's go down into the basement and do some decluttering before we can jump into the transpersonal. That really helps. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not to mention that a very wounded, disorganized ego state will have a very difficult time integrating the transpersonal reality, right? So if you're just operating from your mind because that's the safest place that you have from your own trauma, for a little human mind to experience the transpersonal, just, I think, short circuits it, and you can't integrate the wisdom, the revelations of transpersonal reality into a little human consciousness. I think we have to really work on expanding who we are from just, this cognitive, rational, waking consciousness to include much more of the non-conscious. There's so much more bandwidth that I think we have when we include non-conscious processes into who we are. And I think we've known this from the very beginning. I mean, if you think about Freud's topographical map of the self, he has the 10% of the iceberg, which is your conscious rational mind that you identify with as visible on the surface of the water, but 90% of what's going on with you is truly under the water. You don't see it. It's pretty much invisible to you until you work with psychedelics, right? So that's what it really, I think, brings forth.
Yeah, that is very powerful. Also, I would like to just speak to something, Saj. So in the traditional, I also heard you speak to this once. I think it was one of your conversations that. So in the traditional, so there's a dilemma. I'm seeing a kind of like a conflict almost. Mm-hmm. So. And that is, in my understanding, it goes like this. So in the traditional therapy, there are ethics, there are laws of rules and, all these kind of things that protects the client and the therapist and also the work that is undertaken. And yet psychedelics actually do the exact opposite. They rupture, they destabilize people. It's almost like, how do you work with such powerful substances that are actually capable of doing this, and then how it's a very, I know it's a very big topic, and I know there are lots of work and conversations are happening right now. There should be some allowance, shouldn't it? Because I haven't seen anybody heal through the traditional model where the person's kept safe. There has to be some sort of a level of disruption at some point to in order to shake up things. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there has to be disruption. And I think what you're talking about is the nature of traditional therapy to be very symptom management oriented. If that's the best we can do, meaning managing people's symptoms, having them achieve kind of stability in the world and be functional in the world, then that's great. If that's the best we can do, maybe sometimes that is. But I think in the psychedelic world, we're not looking at symptom management. We're looking at symptom resolution. And to do that, a person's defense mechanisms, their coping mechanisms, the workaround that they've come up to living in a loveless world, for example, or whatever our reality was that when we were children and being formed by that environment, we hold that within us, and a lot of the things that our mind does is to protect us and compartmentalize that reality, and we function apart from that. And if it will still create symptoms, we don't function that well apart from it. But if you're going to go in and you're really going for symptom resolution, then that does mean, taking down those structures that really keep us functioning. So another way to talk about this is somebody has a broken leg and there's no way to work with that. And so they learn to walk on a crutch for their entire life, or a cane. And they become really good and adapted to walking with that crutch. And so we're saying, okay, let's see what happens when you're not using the crutch. And of course, they're going to feel the pain in their leg, right? And so I think that has to happen for the system to start, working with that pain. We have to be able to feel, to see, to experience what that reality was like for us, for our system at this point to go in and start reorganizing it. I think that's getting at your question. Was there a bigger sort of? It seemed like a really big question. I'm only answering a portion of it.
But it's a very clear one. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. The reason I wanted to bring this into our conversation is because I wanted to tie it with some of your work that I have seen that could probably, if somebody is not educated in that mental health approach, especially, I know your work is, your training is towards the clinicians and people in the mental health space who would like to incorporate psychedelic medicines. I understand that, and even to those people who are facilitating psychedelic medicine spaces, your videos can be quite a overwhelmingly disruptive experience, and something they probably lots of people that I speak to don't associate healing with what they see. I mean, what I see in your videos, people are literally discharging a lot of pent-up survival energies and traumas and all of that, literally somatically in shaking or something like that. Even watching is quite difficult. And if you could maybe talk to us, if what level of therapists come to your training and kind of capacity they have in order to hold such powerful experiences, including yourself, to be there and hold that?
Yeah, fantastic question. I will say that, we at one point were really thinking about, okay, how do we open this modality up to the general public? Because many people don't have the resources to go work with a therapist doing this work. And so we really brainstormed on it for a while. And we just kept finding that so many people had significant trauma that we didn't want to develop a home version of this work and then have everybody start really uncovering their traumas in a container that didn't have the right support for it, right? So we made an active decision to say, no, we wanted to limit who came to our trainings to clinicians who at a minimum had two years of clinical experience. And this is because, again, the things that emerge with psychedelic therapy, we want our therapists to have experience holding that intense container for whatever can emerge there. And so the people that we train have been professional therapists for anywhere from 10 to 25 years. And what we see with them is that they are very well processed at what I would call a secondary consciousness level, right? They're very well processed in terms of they know their patterns, they know the things that have happened to them, they've engaged them through secondary consciousness, which is, talk therapy, insight, awareness, things like that. But what we find when we go in both with a medicine like cannabis or ketamine, plus the somatic pathway that those medicines can take, we find that a whole lot of people are very functional because they've been very well compartmentalized, and so, the nature of the work is that it goes right to those places, relatively quickly, they take a deep dive. And so we as trainers have to support that process. And this is one of the big reasons why we changed our training model from 12 to 16 person in-person training, which is actually not that large. If you consider a lot of psychedelic trainings have 300 person Zoom calls that are going on with it, 12 to 16 is pretty small. But we found at the depth at which people were processing, even 12 to 16 was too much. And so we started our apprentice model, which is just 3 students and me, right? Or 3 students and one of our other instructors, sort of taking a deep dive over a period of 5 days. And they just have session after session on those 5 days. And they really see an arc in terms of the development and the sort of the defense mechanisms, the coping mechanisms start to fall away. They see the reality of what's been in their system. They feel it. They're moving through it, and hopefully we get them to the other side of it all before the training ends. And for the most part, we do, I would say. Can we go back to your question again? I think I went down a particular avenue here.
No, but this was really insightful at the same time that you did. I was saying, and I'm glad that you said that they are very specifically to the people that are really working with this model, who are really interested and have the capacity. I heard you saying it a few times in some of your talks. You said, this is not a sitter program, right? I believe the person who offers this level of therapy, I can only imagine they have to go through the same processes to understand in order to have that level of capacity to hold such an intense activations and releases. This was my question, like, how do we make it accessible to other facilitators? Because I have spoken to many medicine facilitators, Saj, that they haven't even experienced probably one of your type of, activated, released, those kind of processes in their circles, and that's quite worrying, because the medicines are so unpredictable, and we can never tell when it's going to happen to the person, and if it does happen, what will happen then?
Yeah.
Right? This would be my question. How do we make this accessible to the world of facilitators of that psychedelic medicines?
Yeah, well, I mean, I will say that psychotherapy and certainly psychedelic therapy are an art form, right? I know there's profound need for this in the world, but that doesn't change the nature of what it takes for somebody to really go through their own experience, their own process, and be able to sort of facilitate this depth of work for people. And it just takes time. It just, you cannot rush an art form that people, it will take them some time to actually become good at. And if we could train more people at any one time, I would love to do that. If we could scale like that, I would love to do that. But my commitment is to the fidelity of the model. My commitment is to the fidelity of the process that people are going through. And if we can't hold that well for larger groups, then we can't do larger groups, right? So it just takes time. And, this is sort of a question of saying, like, look, here we are, a culture that's completely alien from our own primary consciousness, right? From our own true nature. And then, and we've been living like this for quite some time. And all of a sudden we're realizing this now, and we're feeling the need to drop down into our roots for our sanity. And, those systems weren't meant to be scaled that quickly. This is not capitalism where you can, build more widgets in China or something like that. People it just takes time. But I will tell you, this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. I already know that. Like, every time I go into a training, sort of the awe and the intelligence that I see arising in front of me, to even the intelligence of this person's system and their coping mechanisms is beautiful to behold. And then how their systems operate now, with a lot more resources on board, with a lot more relationship on board, right? With a lot more attachment on board that's being offered by the therapist. We see a great, it's this natural, organic movement that's already in the person's system, that's just waiting to go, given the right container, given the right initial circumstances.
That's wonderful. And I would like to quickly move into this question of the role of the relationship in the psychedelic session, and also the role of the body. And some of the things that I've already heard you speak to is the window of tolerance and the transference, right? Some of these things are incredibly valuable to me, and I hope our listeners will find that too. Could you please speak to that as well?
Okay, so there's a whole bunch in there. So if I'm going to forget a bunch, so please do.
I'll remind you.
Okay.
So the role of the relationship, firstly,
Yeah. So I think the role of the relationship and the window of tolerance goes together. So I'll just speak to them both at the same time. And I think many of your listeners will probably have experience, or if they're clinicians, they'll know about the window of tolerance. And that's a basic idea, is that, in terms of our nervous system response, if we're getting too activated, meaning there's too much intensity or hyper arousal in the system, the idea is that that's not therapeutically useful, right? And then the reverse, if we're going too low, becoming too numb or dissociative or depressive or something like that, or hypo-aroused, then that's also not a workable area. So there's an idea, it was really founded by sensory motor psychotherapy, and I think it's spread to other certainly somatic modalities, and it's in a lot of non-somatic modalities, that you have to keep people in this workable range to do effective therapy. All right. And I think that's, so first of all, let me acknowledge that, if you're living your life, if you're have to be functional for work or picking your kids up from school, being well regulated is a necessary, wonderful thing to get on board. So I really see the value of that. However, when it comes to processing trauma, right? Trauma does not live in the moderate zones for people. Trauma doesn't live in sort of this happy realm that we want to stay in. Trauma is trauma because it was highly activated, because it was highly dissociative and numbed out, right? So my sense of this is that if we're going to go get the trauma, we have to go to those places. We have to be willing to go to those places where this person's system got kind of cut off and encapsulated to reclaim those parts of that person. And I think the window of tolerance ultimately is a concept, is an idea for secondary consciousness, right? It's if you want to keep your secondary consciousness functional, you have to stay in the window of tolerance. However, we're not working in secondary consciousness, we're working in primary consciousness. And we find that, if people go in with psychedelics, they do not stay in anything that resembles the window of tolerance, right? Every single MDMA session that we had at MAPS, I would say very well exceeded that window of tolerance. And so I think it's going to be sort of a problem that we have with somatic therapies entering into the psychedelic world, if you insist on like regulation and window of tolerance as your primary touchstone, as opposed to saying, no, I think there's great value in leaving that realm. Now, I think ultimately the reason why window of tolerance was developed is to prevent re-traumatization, right? So there's this idea that, people going in and contacting these highly activated states is re-traumatizing for them. And that's not what I see at all. Certainly not in the psychedelic world. And I think the research points to that, people that routinely go and make contact with these states that they have in themselves that are outside of the window of tolerance aren't re-traumatized. But there's, I think, a real reason for at least how we approach this, which is to say, we want to have a solution on board before we have clients re-experience their trauma, right? So think about it this way. The things that are traumatizing to children that would not be traumatizing to adults, right? And the big difference between a child and an adult is the capacities that a child has versus the capacities that an adult has, right? So a child is completely reliant upon their family, mom, dad, to help them when they become really distressed or there's trauma happening. And if in fact the threat is coming from mom or dad, then that's when the child system very quickly says, I'm out of here. I'm going to dissociate, right? Versus an adult system, well, if difficult things are happening, they have strength, they have financial resources, they can leave the situation, right? So what we find on a reliable basis is that the level of solution somebody has internalized into their system really does determine how easily they are able to work with trauma in the present moment, and also whether they were traumatized and had PTSD symptoms at all, right? So we know, for example, that people that have insecure attachment, they have a lot more PTSD coming back from war than people that had secure attachment, right? So one of the things that traumatic experience does is it shakes you to your core. And if at your core you find goodness, you find connection with your family, if you find love there, then that's what you can rebuild from. But if at your core you find more trauma or more emptiness, it's really hard for people to rebuild. And so what we're suggesting is that instead of window of tolerance, we're insisting on relationship between the client and the therapist, right? And it's this, I know the word insisting is strong, but we're saying like, look, if a client is processing and they're going to a highly dissociative state, we are going to really ally with that person and say, take me with you into this floaty, non-existent realm that you're experiencing right now. And so it's like having a tether. They're going to their dissociation, yet they're tethered back to the therapist through that relationship. And usually we find that that connection, that attachment relationship is an inoculating factor for all the things that have happened to people, right? So the basic idea with this is if you added relationship into all the traumas that we've experienced as children, right? If you added a sense of warm, competent parenting, nurturing parenting into that equation, we would have been so much better off, right? And so that's what we're adding to people's system as they go into these highly dissociative or reactive trauma states. This is why, the therapist has to do their own work, because the client isn't just talking about going there, they're going there. Right. So the entire room fills up with that field. The entire room becomes dissociative or becomes highly activated. So the therapist's nervous system you have to have your seat to be able to go into those realms. Right. So I think I addressed two of the.
Yeah, super valuable. This is super important. And I think it's super valuable right now. And as you said earlier in the beginning of our conversation, if trauma is a relational effect, then of course it's going to need other bodies to heal with together. In that relationship. I think it's so valuable right now. So we're going to talk about the other thing is the working with transference.
Oh, yeah.
This is my favorite.
It is my favorite too. It's when it's the more advanced layer of the PSI training. We do it in the level 1, but it takes people time to really get good at this. So let me just describe what's going on here, right? So working with transference was something that really got developed with the psychoanalytic, the Freudian schools of psychology. It's one of their key interventions, I would say, with the psychodynamic trainings and modalities. And basically what transference is that, you have complicated or incomplete experiences with relationships in your life, right? And they could be traumatic experiences. They could just be, abandoning, neglectful experiences. But the places that in our relational history where we got crushed, right? And so our systems are geared, are hell-bent, I should say, on taking those relationships and then transferring them to people in our current lives, and our systems do this in an attempt to heal, right? So in other words, it's saying, hey, I got crushed in this relational dance way back then, and I am going to let's play this out again, and hopefully I don't get crushed. I find mastery, right? And so most people that are working with mental health concerns their wounding is in the relational realm. And so transference is always present in your client's process. They are just making an assessment whether you can hold it or not as a clinician, right? Their system's making an assessment that, they feel these negative things towards you. And if they say them to you, they think you're going to leave them. They think you're going to get angry at them or become resentful or cold or, punitive or something like that. And so they just don't say it. Right. So, but if the clinician or if the sitter were to start inquiring questions like, how do you feel towards me right now? How do you think I feel towards you right now? So really, the focus is not just the client's what they're seeing, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what their sensations are, but the focus is also the relationship between the client and the therapist. That's when you're going to open the door to pretty intensely negative transference. Now, the problem with this is that almost no one in the US anyway, it's different in Europe, but almost nobody in the US is trained to work with transference, right? I used to give a lot of talks to graduate students in psych, and I would ask them, like, how many people have trained to work with transference or had a class on transference or something like that. And you'd get some people raise their hand, and then I say, how many people like really have worked with it as opposed to just knowing the definition of it? And almost every hand goes down, and it's just like one or two people at most with their hands up. And so this is an incredibly rich area. There's so much healing when you can go in and work with the transferential reality, the relational ruptures that people have in their system. And because the more you get to work with them in that psychedelic space, the less that this person has to reenact them outside of that psychedelic space in the relationships that truly matter to them, right?
Wow,
and
very
I do,
powerful.
yeah, no, it's there. It's always there. And the fact that like it never comes up in or rarely comes up in ceremonies, or it rarely comes up in sitter models, is because those containers are not designed to track for it or allow it. If you were to allow it, it would fill up the room.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it will probably jump on everywhere and kind of bleed all over the place, and everybody will be impacted by this. I have been observing circles in, the traditional way of working with the medicine, and you just observe somebody, suddenly the facilitator becomes their abusive mother, or the sibling, or some associate, or a friend, or a romantic partner, or however. It's very, very delicate when this comes up. So I think including in the training is, I think, absolutely critical, in my understanding anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an important thing to notice is when it does come up, I think most clinicians will have this knee-jerk reaction to go to the positive, meaning that, if a negative transference comes up, the clinician will want to say, no, I'm not that. I don't feel that way towards you. I care about you. I'm your ally. I'm here for you, right? So they're really going towards establishing that positive role, which I actually think is probably the best thing for them to do if that container is not set up appropriately to work with transference, which does take time. Right. But truly to work with it, it means we have to leave the leave the positive and accept the negative role that the client system is handing us. Right. So let me give you an example of this that, I was doing oh boy, this is a difficult one but I'll say, I was doing a training at one point, and, like one of the students was going back to this experience that they had in childhood where they just felt ugly, and she just felt really ugly, and she felt like the people around her related to her that like she was ugly, and then she started handing me that role that I saw her that way, right? And so of course one option is to like back away from it, like I said, go to the positive and just say, no, you're not, and that was just, you thought you were, something like that, right? Put it in context. But the other way, if what we're truly doing is saying, yes, let me help you work this out. Let me help this truly emerge into the room so you can feel it here, as opposed to just holding it by yourself, which is to say, go with it, go along with it, right? And then, so the response would be something like, yes, you're ugly. And then let's feel this together. Right. So we're saying on the one hand, we're validating the horror that somebody's holding inside of them. And on the other hand, we're saying, but we're doing this together in relationship. Right. So they're really in any PSIP session, there's always these two dynamics that we're paying attention to, sort of, allowing that truth that your client is holding inside of themselves to emerge and fill up the room, and validating it, so not sugarcoating it, not saying things like, oh, even though you thought you were ugly, because that's, again, it's taking one step away from how the client actually experiences it, which is that they are, right? And so doing that on one hand, and on the other hand, insisting on relationship as we go in and do this. And we find that relationship is, again, such a powerful background in which to hold trauma that it allows the person's system to start processing.
Wow, so powerful, Saj. This is incredible, especially in a world that everybody's somehow trained to be rescuers. Like, yes. We never allow anybody to feel anything anymore,
I'll just say that the dark side of rescuing, the shadow of the rescuing, is that it feels fantastic for the therapist to be the rescuer, right? It's just like, if you ask yourself, like, what's the best way that you could be seen by any other human being? Most people would say, oh, as, somebody that is just warm and loving and rescuing of like that kind of thing, which is great. It's true, right? It's a resourcing way to be seen by people. However, the dark side, the shadow side is the more that you as the clinician hog that rescuing role, it doesn't mean the other negative transferences that the client is holding in their system goes away, right? It just means they're not emerging with you. Where they will be emerging is when this person goes home and has to interact with their family, right? All the negative transference will be going to their spouse because they're the closest person to them. And they're going to be comparing them to you. They're going to be comparing their spouse to you who, you have this very limited relationship that's, a one-way street of you just being attentive and attuned and caring and loving. Their spouse cannot compete with that, right? And so I think the shadow of the therapist always being in that positive transference role is that it can ruin people's relationships. It can make things really rough for the clients when they go home.
I agree. So that makes me pretty happy, quite happy that I have been fired so many times because I didn't rescue. So that's a good thing to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good for
you.
Yeah.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
This has been super, super valuable, Saj, and it's just hope our listeners are really taking so much out of it. I know we are coming to the end of our conversation. Before we let you go, please talk to us about your trainings. And I know you have spoken about cannabis.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of our listeners are really affiliated with this medicine. It's a very powerful medicine. Lucky for me that I don't come from a recreational place of any of these substances. So my relationship or my understanding or connections have always been sacred and powerful to all of them. But I am aware that some listeners may have used it as a recreational to avoid, to escape, to numb themselves. And there you are using the same medicine to incredibly, do this deep trauma work. Yeah. If you can maybe talk to us a bit about that.
To that, yeah. So we focus on cannabis and ketamine in our trainings only because for a couple of reasons. One is cannabis, I think, is the people's psychedelic, meaning that it's not going to be regulated by federal agencies in the way, at least in the United States and all of Canada and parts of Europe, this is widely available. It's inexpensive, and you don't even need a doctor's, permission to work with it. And we work with ketamine because it's also very legally available for people. But truly, what we're doing is a non-medicine specific modality, meaning that, we can be working with cannabis and ketamine, but we can also, the same thing could happen with MDMA, the same thing could happen with psilocybin. There are differences in these medicines, and there are similarities. The similarities is that they all go towards disrupting default mode network and secondary consciousness and give us much more access to primary consciousness. The difference is, which I will say that if there were only two psychedelics that were ever going to be available in the world, for me, the first one would absolutely be cannabis over anything else. And probably the second one would be psilocybin, right? And what I mean by that is that cannabis is not a wide spectrum psychedelic experience. It is a very predictable, reliable, narrowed experience. But the thing that it does is miraculous, right? It's an extraordinary focus thing that it does, which again is we use it because it really supports people clearing their dissociation at that tier 1 state. And once that happens, once their dissociation, their nervous system processes well work, then you can bring the other types of psychedelics into play. So when we were working in Amsterdam with seeing clients there, people came from the US, from different places, specifically to work with psilocybin. And we got to the point, because there were enough people that were complete non-responders to psilocybin, we got to the point where we just said to everybody, we're not fully aware of how much or how little dissociation is in your system, but we're starting everybody off with 3 sessions of cannabis-assisted PSIP sessions. And then we can move to the other medicines. And we found that made a huge difference. So even just 3 of these cannabis sessions does a significant amount to crack people's dissociation. So that's the role of cannabis. And in terms of the trainings, in terms of let me go back to what you were saying. Like, what if people use them recreationally, right? So I have a great a series of case studies for this, which is that we did a pilot study with a group of combat veterans in Denver, and these folks used an enormous amount of cannabis on a daily basis to manage their PTSD symptoms, right? And certainly they went through the VA system here, tried all the psychiatric meds that just turned them into zombies, tried prolonged exposure. They did everything they were supposed to through the VA system in traditional mental health. And then where they settled was that they just used lots of cannabis on a daily basis, and that was the best. And so they had a great deal of doubt, right? They had a great deal of nocebo coming into working with us. And we found that even people that used it extensively on a daily basis, if you change the context in which cannabis is being used from a recreational kind of numbing out context or to a psychotherapy context that's really designed to go in and focus on body process, cannabis becomes an incredible excavation tool. It's the best thing that I've seen for really resolving that dissociation. And I'm including MDMA in that. I think MDMA is the second best thing that I've seen for resolving dissociation. And both of these, not surprisingly, are body. Both MDMA and cannabis really take people to their body. And I think that's where we need to be to resolve that dissociation. And then sort of the bigger picture in terms of the trainings, again, this is a non-medicine specific modality, which is to say that, having your body available to you, having sort of your full feeling heart and your gut available to you, regardless of what medicine you work with, is going to be a really good idea. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And that really changes everything, and it makes so much sense right now, because it's not the medicine, it's the container that is coming into the space to do the work. That's super helpful.
Yeah, it's all of us. It is the medicine, it is a person's own innate healing intelligence, and it is our relationship. We can't, all 3 of those, I think, really combine to see the effects that we see in the model.
That's wonderful. And one quick last question, if you don't mind me squeezing in. How do you feel about some of those therapists who say, no, don't touch psychedelic medicines. You have everything innately within you. You should not go there. You'll be re-traumatized. You could just do the work without touching or ingesting anything into your system.
Wow. I would say to them that, just look at the research. If you look at cognitive behavioral therapy, it's the major model in most places. Cognitive behavioral therapy, in the best laboratory controlled conditions, has a 24% success rate, right? And that's when for these trials that they use CBT with, they're ruling out people that have dual diagnosis. They're ruling out people that have depression along with the thing that they're looking to treat. So it's a very rarefied person that they're running these trials with CBT. And even in that population, you're getting like a 24% success rate. If you start to include those other sort of populations that get weeded out of those trials, I think the success rate goes down to something like 5%, right? So this is me just saying, like, I don't see this happening in traditional therapy. I see people going into therapy for years and years and years. Many people don't have to do that. Maybe some people just have minor disturbances, but the people that stay in therapy for years, I don't think their needs are being met in therapy. I think anybody, for example, who is in therapy because they have disturbed relationships, because they have attachment wounding, talk therapy, secondary consciousness therapy is never going to get at that, right? Because, our attachment process was so early on in our lives. The programming that our systems have really developed is so below the level of our verbal capacity to experience. And I will say, when I see people, when I see their systems using medicine and going in the body process and really starting to uncover and rework their attachment, it is so painful for people, right? It is like exquisitely painful for them. Like imagine an open little kid with like so much trust and so much openness to the world, and they're being rejected, they're being hurt, they're being, and that sweet little heart has to turn off to the world. Their sweet little heart has to turn off to human relationship to deal with what's happening to them, right? So that takes an enormous amount of pain for that protective mechanism to come on board. And when people are going and working in that space, like, I don't see it any other way. I don't see a person's system without the aid of these medicines being able to open the door to that kind of experience. And I will tell you, even though it's exquisitely painful, people are so grateful for it because they've been trying to get at it for years and years in therapy, right? Like, so if you give me the opportunity to experience exquisite pain for short durations of time that really are moving my system along and really giving me more options in terms of relationship, then I would much rather take that than, taking this, this cardboard version of reality, or this like really protected version of reality where my heart is not feeling another human being, So I actually do tell students, on our website, we want to be very clear with people that this work is not for every client. This work is not for every therapist, right? So that's why we're trying to be very explicit with what the process looks like. So if somebody's just like, thank you for describing that to me, I'm not up for that, I will say, great, okay, good choice, right? And then there's other people that are up for that. And for them, I think we should have that option.
Absolutely. It's super helpful. Thank you so much. And lastly, how could people reach you guys, and how can we access to the trainings and some of the projects that you guys are offering? I'm sure we'll have everything in the show notes, but just a few words from you would be nice.
Yeah, so here's a couple of things that would be really useful. So even if you didn't do our training, even if you weren't a clinician, I think there's plenty of videos and resources that we're putting out that are very, very informative. So if you're a sitter or you're thinking about doing this type of work, I would highly recommend going to the PSI website, which is psychedelic-somatic.org. And so there's lots of videos and things on there that I think you'll find useful. Just go to the videos page. And the very first one on there is an 1 hour and 10-minute excerpt from one of our trainings that describes a nervous system map and sort of how we work with it with psychedelics. I think people will find that incredibly useful, whether they take our training or not. So I'd highly recommend doing that. And the other thing is, I should say that, so for the rest of 2022, our trainings are booked up. We don't have any more space in them, but we're just about to release our 2023 schedule. So if people are interested, or they were at the PSI website and saw that all of our trainings were booked, we're going to release our 2023 training dates for folks. And right now, that's for the most part going to involve, if you're in the US, coming to Denver for 5 days, or we're building out another hub in Vancouver, and we're looking at Amsterdam as another hub. We've done a number of trainings there. And so Europe is high on our list to have a hub for trainings. I think that was what.
Yeah, that was that's okay. That covers everything. Hopefully, are you considering a hub in the UK? That would be so wonderful.
I would love it. Yeah. But my understanding is that so let me just clarify. We only run trainings where cannabis is relatively easy for people to get, because even if we could work with other medicines, our program is designed that the first 2 to 3 sessions that anybody has are going to be with cannabis, and then they can move to whatever else they want as long as it's legal. And so we only do trainings where cannabis is relatively easy for people to access. They don't have to break the laws to get it. And my understanding was that the UK was not one of those places, but I think the laws are changing there, if that's...
It is, yes. Currently, a lot is changing. Like every other country, there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of, things are happening quite fast. So hopefully...
Wonderful. Yeah.
In future plans, hopefully we'll have you over here. Thank you for all the work you're doing. Honestly, it's really definitely changed the way that I look at therapy. I'm forever grateful for your team and you for doing all this work. So I want to say thank you on behalf of us from the UK, and please keep going. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, hopefully we'll have you back very soon.
I know you love to be back. This was great. Thank you. Yeah.
Of course. I know you have a super busy schedule, but I'm sure we'll somehow have you back in the future and catch up with everything.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Okay.
Great. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Please do get in touch with Saj and myself. Drop in the comments. Your questions are welcome. Don't be shy. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye for now. Much love. Thank you so much for joining us. Psychedelic Conversations podcast is designed to educate, inform, and expand awareness. For more information, please head over to psychedelicconversations.com. You can also share with your friends or leave a review so that we can reach more people. You can also join us in our private Facebook group to keep the conversation going. This show is for information purposes only, and it is not intended to provide mental health or medical advice. Thanks for listening.